All right, so now on to my talk. And please stop me if I'm going a little long-winded as I'm going through this. So, the origin of life, all right. Was it miraculous or not? And this is a question that has really perplexed people throughout, history. As we read in Genesis, right? Genesis gives a very miraculous account of how the cosmos were created in 7 days and how life came about in a single day, basically from nothingness to life, right? So is that account meant to be literal? Is it meant to be allegorical? Or did that day happen in a single day or not? All that sort of stuff. All right. So what am I going to do here? So I'm number one. I'm not a theologian. All right. So everything that I say that is theologically based here, take it with a grain of salt. I do my best with that. But, truth in advertising. All right. So my actual plan then, as I'm going through here, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the science governing the origin of life. All right. What sort of principles govern this? What are some current research that's being done in this area? Those sorts of things. And we'll be discussing what we know, or at least think we know, about the origin of life and whether or not it might have had a natural cause. All right, then I'm going to get into the theology side a little bit and discuss what a miracle even is, and then start to speculate a little bit. So try to not throw tomatoes at me and stuff like that as I do so. All right, and then finally end up with my best guess as to what the answer is, or maybe not so much what the answer is, what sort of attitude we should have in approaching the answer. Because I honestly think we don't know right now, is what I'll say. All right, so first thing I want to say, which most of you guys are scientists in here, so I don't really need to preach too much to you on this, is evolution is different than the origin of life, but the two are related to each other. So first of all, evolution speaks about how life came to be. I'm going to back up the clock to the actual moment that life started, rather than once we have life, how does life change and become new species and stuff like that. All right, but some of the same principles that govern evolution still apply, as we'll see as we go through this. All right, I don't think there are any creationists in here, but let's just say you're a creationist and you don't believe in evolution. All right, well, for the purpose of this talk, you don't have to, because we're before evolution. All right, but the thing I want to stress here, even if you were a creationist, right? The Bible says on the third day in Genesis 1 that we switched from a planet devoid of life to one with life, right? So we can still ask the question, how, right? What actually changed during that time? What was there before that? What was there after that, right? So the question still does remain, even if there are miraculous underpinnings here. All right, and so even if it was miraculous, what can we still learn about that event? All right, so starting off with, what is life? Now, life is essentially, from a biochemical standpoint, simply a collection of chemicals that have specific properties. All right, the property of organization. All right, those molecules are contained in defined space, are often polymerized together, organized into compartments, stuff like that. All life exhibits this property of metabolism, or their chemical reactions that produce energy inside of the cells, or they can be used to produce other molecules that the cell needs in order to survive. Homeostasis, the cell can maintain its intercellular environment, even in response to changes from the outside. Growth, so cells can grow, or life can grow and reproduce, and respond to external stimulus. All right. And even if you don't believe that evolution gave rise to the origin of all species we have now, life is currently evolving, and this is a property that life currently exhibits. It can change and evolve and adapt to new situations that it finds itself in. Now, one of the key aspects of this, then, is that different entities can be more or less lifelike. So there's actually, I'll say, a gradient of life-likeness, all right, where you would say that a stone is not very lifelike, right? doesn't have much in the way of organization, certainly doesn't exhibit metabolism or anything like that. But a protein, though, is significantly more organized and might carry out a single reaction for metabolism. Then you have lipid membrane. It has numerous different molecules contained within it. It can lead to homeostasis, things like that. Then you have viruses, which again exhibit a lot of these properties, but still can't fully replicate on its own. And then you have cells and larger organisms. Now, why this is important is we know that things exist between, inorganic matter and life, right, which is necessary for the formation of life. We have to have these sort of intermediaries here. So what sort of molecules are needed? We need nucleic acids, right? They code for proteins that can catalyze chemical reactions. That actually ends up being a very, very important point, is that RNA, we actually know that RNA is capable of carrying out chemistry, right? So you both can code for information and catalyze chemical reactions. Proteins are the main workhorses of our cell, carry out most of the reactions of metabolism, give us our energy and stuff like that, as well as providing structure to the cell components and stabilizing things like our nucleic acids. Lipids comprise our membranes and basically define the boundaries of the living organism. And in doing so, they keep certain things in the cell and other things outside of the cell. It can also provide energy storage. And then we have sugars, right? Sugars are the energy components of our cell, our metabolism, and basically we really can't have life without them because all life needs energy in order to grow, reproduce, and carry out metabolism. So we need those sugars. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the complexity of life, and then we'll get into how life might have evolved. So the first thing I want to drive home is how complex is something like a protein, right? So first of all, what is a protein? Protein is a chain of amino acids, and amino acids are basically building blocks. You can think those sorts of terms. And this chain of amino acids folds into a complicated 3D structure that has specific properties and specific chemistries, right? Now, let's take an average size protein. Average size protein has 300 amino acids, approximately, right? To give you an idea of how complex that is, this is a molecule with 5,800 atoms, a very, very large molecule, much larger than water or carbon dioxide or anything like that. Right? Well, further complexity. Well, each one of those 300 amino acids in that chain, there are 20 different possibilities for each of those positions. Now, if we do some math here, the total number of proteins you can have for an average size protein is 20 to the 300th power, which computes to, in scientific notation, 2 times 10 to the 390th power different combinations that you can come up with. Now, how big of a number is that? The number of atoms in the universe is estimated to be 1 times 10 to the 82. All right, so for a single protein, we have more possibilities than there are atoms in the universe, right? Just it's mind-boggling, right? So how can it even be that we can ever find a protein that has a particular function, right? Valid question. We'll get to it. All right, another way that cells or life is complicated. This is metabolism, and this is actually only a small snapshot of metabolism. Right? Each little thing like this here is a chemical, and it gets turned into another chemical or into another chemical, so on and so forth. All right. This is the complex network of metabolism. All of these different molecules are required for life as we understand it. So you have to have all of these inside of a cell. All right. What about the cell itself? How complex is it? Well, there have been numerous efforts made in recent years to actually derive and produce what is called a minimal cell, where they're basically taking genes and trying to delete genes one after another to see how small they can possibly get a cell's genome. And the record currently is a minimum size of 473 genes. Now, there is one known organism that has a smaller genome, It's a bacteria with 182 genes, but this bacteria actually has to live inside of another cell in order to survive. So, you, uh, so we can say maybe we can get down to 182, or maybe the magic number is 473. Who really knows, right? But out of those genes, what are they doing, right? That's what this pie chart is showing us. So roughly half the genes are involved in gene expression and maintaining the DNA inside of the cell. About 20% are required for metabolism, roughly 20% for maintaining the architecture of the cell, and another 20 that are basically fall into this other category here. So that's the minimum that's required. So in order to have life, then it appears that we need at least 400-ish genes to all occur in one location at one time in order for the cell to start replicating. Seems very, very improbable, right? All right, maybe, right? But some kind of sub questions here, for instance, right? Are all these functions that were present, they're present now inside of a cell, were they required for primitive life? So, for instance, if a cell is swimming around inside of an environment where there are no living competitors, right? Does it need all the same features nowadays? An example of this is lipid synthesis necessary for a primitive cell? What if there were just tons of lipids floating around in the ocean, right? Then the primitive cell might not actually need to be able to carry out lipid synthesis yet, right? And so as a result of this, these functions could possibly be added stepwise, right? So you don't necessarily need all 473 at the same time. You at least kind of hypothesize this, we'll say. All right, now the message I want to get through, yes. Exactly. To the best of my knowledge, no. That sounds like an awesome experiment, though. Yeah, and the question is basically, what Dr. Dorosky is saying is this symbiotic bacteria with 182 genes that might actually mimic a protocell or a first cell, because the surrounding environment around the cell might actually have mimicked the host organism or something like that. So it's possible you could possibly even get under that given the right set of conditions. And yeah, I'm unaware of any such studies, but certainly could be some. Yeah. Yes. People have tried that, and so thus far we have been unable to create life. Basically, so we definitely cannot do that at this point in time. So yeah, yeah. All right, so life is incredibly complex, so it's definitely improbable, right? Well, I'm going to say no, right? So complex does not equal improbable. I'll give you an example from biochemistry, something called Levinthal's paradox. All right, so what I want you to do here is imagine a small protein of about 100 amino acids trying to fold. So all of our proteins have to fold into their correct 3D structure in order to carry out their functions. Now, for each one of those amino acids, we're going to assume that the amino acid can adopt only 3 conformations at each of its 2 rotational angles, right? Now, some proteins or some amino acids actually have more than 2 rotational angles, so we're actually underestimating, right? Right. So you get 3 to the 200th power different conformations that the protein can adopt. Molecules can move pretty quickly. So a protein can basically sample around 10 to the 13 different shapes every single second. All right, so that's really, really fast, right? Given that if you take the top number divided by the bottom number, it would take 10 to the 87th power seconds for a protein to fold. which is many orders of magnitude greater than the age of the universe. All right. But it happens all the time. It happens, most proteins fold in less than a second inside of our cells. So how do they do this? All right. So this is a very, very complex problem, but it's not an improbable one. All right. The answer is that there's something else that we didn't understand or that was not included in those assumptions there. Right. There's something missing. And so this idea of sequential folding. And so what is illustrated here is basically a monkey. It's actually a computer program, but a monkey randomly typing on a keyboard trying to reproduce Shakespeare. Now, if you waited for the monkey to randomly type out, "Me thinks it is like a weasel," right? That's going to take a really, really, really long time for that particular sequence of characters to arrive, right? But if instead, every time the monkey hits a correct key, we keep it. And that's what all these green boxes are here. Then we arrive at the correct solution much, much, much more quickly as a result of that. All right. And so proteins actually behave in a similar way, where as they're starting to fold, one part of the protein will adopt a stable conformation and get locked into that state, which thereby reduces the total number of possible conformations for the rest of the protein. Right, and as a result, we arrive at the solution much, much more quickly. All right, so now actually talking about the formation of life. All right, so what are some of the principles that govern this? Well, first of all, we absolutely need carbon and water. All right, so if you read science fiction about silicon-based life, it's probably hogwash. All right, just due to the unique chemistry of carbon and water, both are. I'm 99.99999% sure both are required. All right, we'll just say that. And so that's one of the principles. The second principle is that we've seen with proteins and with nucleic acids that we have to be able to build up complexity from basic building blocks. Another requirement, all right? And the third requirement, tying back to evolution, is that some Darwinian principles are going to govern this process in all likelihood. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so carbon basically is able to make four bonds as opposed to many, many other elements. And those four bonds are uniquely stable. So, for instance, silicon is often claimed to be a candidate for life and stuff like that. Silicon can also make four bonds. But silicon is so much bigger than carbon that those bonds are inherently very, very weak. And so silicon compounds tend to fall apart much more easily than carbon compounds do. And then other elements simply can't make as many bonds. So nitrogen can only make 3 bonds, oxygen can only make 2, stuff like that, greatly restricting the number of different types of molecules that are possible, I would say. Water is, first of all, able to dissolve lots and lots of things. That's kind of requirement number one. Requirement number two, it can act as an acid and a base, thereby allowing a lot of different chemistry to occur. Yeah. Yes. So H2S is not, I mean, it's not super polar, first of all. And I guess presumably you could have H2S or something like that as a solvent, but it would have to be much, much colder or under much higher pressures, obviously, in order for life to occur under those situations. So I suppose there could maybe be a few other possibilities for water, maybe. I'm not as convinced on that one, I'll say. Yeah. All right. Now, about these Darwinian principles, then. Right. So, in the absence of life, why does Darwin apply? Well, we need these molecules that we're making, molecules we're building up to, first of all, be stable. Right. And if a molecule is stable, it's going to tend to persist in the environment and thereby build up its concentration. All right, so we actually see evidence of this. So, for instance, the most common sugar in all of our bodies is glucose. Well, guess what the most stable sugar is? Glucose, right? And then the other principle is the ability to replicate. So basically, molecules that are not very stable are not fit, and they won't persist. Right? And as soon as we develop a molecule that can replicate, assuming we can do this, right, it's quickly going to overtake any other molecules that are present. Right, so what steps are involved then with these principles? The first step basically is we have to form the building blocks. So we need amino acids, we need nucleotides, we need sugars, and we know that some of these at least appear to be easy to form. Right? Then we have to start linking these building blocks together. This is where the science starts to get a little iffy, right? Linking together some of these building blocks, some of this chemistry is not well known or not well developed, I'll say. As a result of linking them together, fit molecules will start to persist, and we should start seeing evolution of function. All right, now, why would we see these molecules start to obtain function? Well, if a molecule binds a ligand or binds to something else, it actually gains stability, believe it or not. Just you can actually prove this thermodynamically, that a molecule bound to something is more stable than a molecule that is not bound to something. And then, all right, once we have macromolecules that have some functions, at some point, we need these molecules to develop the ability to replicate. And this is the basis for what is called the RNA world hypothesis, where basically the first molecules that started to replicate were RNA molecules that could actually replicate themselves, because RNA both carry out chemistry and code information. It's a hypothesis, all right? And then at some point, this is one of the biggest hurdles, I'd say. We have to translate that ability of an RNA molecule to replicate into a genetic code. So it has to be a dependence on the protein fitness and the protein function, also on the genetic code. So we have to tie together these two fitnesses in some way, shape, or form. That is very, very mysterious, I will say right now. All right, and then lastly, we have to encapsulate all this stuff inside of a membrane and start replicating and growing in that context. All right, so what do we know about this whole process? So starting off at the very beginning, one of the first experiments was by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, and basically what they did, they took a simple mixture of gases, water vapor, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen gas, heated them up, and applied some sparks, right? And after a certain amount of time, they saw, okay, what do we have in here? And what they saw is there were amino acids, right? They were able to develop doing this really simple experiment. And then starting to explore our solar system and stuff like that, we've seen evidence for amino acids and other simple molecules that are necessary for the formation of life elsewhere in the solar system, like on comets or even on other planets. So it appears that some of these building blocks are fairly commonplace in the cosmos. Not all of them, I'll say, right? Some of them. And we also know, as I've said, that RNA has this unique ability to both code information and catalyze reactions. All right. So what about what is currently being done? What sort of discoveries are being made nowadays? Right. So origin of life research is ongoing, and there are significant strides being made every year in this area. Right. One example is shown here. I'm not going to go through this whole scheme here by any means, but there's a lot of organic chemistry. But basically, what this depicts is a plausible synthesis of nucleotides in prebiotic Earth. So all the reactants here are very, very small things. Small molecule up there, small molecule here, a very, very simple sugar, right? So these very small building blocks, under the right set of conditions, can actually add together, combine, and form both our pyrimidine nucleotides down here and our purine nucleotides down here, right? Now, this problem prior to 2017 was actually very mysterious. It's actually been shown that yes, under prebiotic conditions, you can produce pyrimidines. or you can produce purines. But you actually can't produce both under the same set of conditions. Actually, one set of conditions makes it extremely unfavorable for the other set of conditions. This particular research showed that using a different scheme, both can form under the same set of conditions. Right. Another example. Right. In this study, some scientists started off with a random peptide library. Right. Basically, they have a sequence of 80 amino acids, and it said how many of these random 80 amino acid peptides can bind to ATP. I'm not going to get into the science or and exactly how they did that for the sake of time. I'll tell you they found a significant number of hits here. And basically, the hit rate they had was about 1 in 10 to the 11th sequences. Now, that might seem like a very, very rare phenomenon. Let me put that in a different context for you. It basically means if you have a nanogram of random protein, you have a protein in there that can bind ATP. All right. So that's actually a very, very small amount and actually a pretty common occurrence. So functional proteins actually appear to be much more common than we previously thought. Again, this was discovered in 2001. Recent to me, not so recent to you guys, I know, sorry. All right, other pieces of the puzzle. So what about RNA? So we know RNA can code genetic information. We also know it can carry out reactions. We now know that RNA can actually synthesize other RNA molecules. You actually have RNA that is capable of replicating other RNA molecules. All right. Again, that was discovered in 2011, and further work is still being done on this. All right, so then the main question, was the origin of life miraculous? So basically, I'm going to start off by asking, what is a miracle? Because I think we have to start there, first of all. All right. The first thing I'm going to say here, though, is that oftentimes the arguments that go along with origin of life, I regard as very presumptuous. Have this sort of format up here. Basically, we know a ton of chemistry, and there are so many improbable holes in our understanding of chemistry that it's only reasonable to, in our understanding of the origin of life, I should say, it's only reasonable to conclude that the origin of life must have been miraculous, right? But people who are saying that are basically presuming that we know all of chemistry, which we don't. We're learning a lot every single year about chemistry. Right? And I would argue that humility is essential in science because it's the basis of the discovery, right? I think I know everything. I'm not going to discover anything. All right. My own personal example of this and related to the origin of life. All right. The handedness problem in the origin of life. All right. So this is a very, very common argument actually for the miraculous origin of life. So with our amino acids, they can basically occur in a left-handed or a right-handed version. All right, they're non-equal images. And what I mean by this, if you look at your hands, basically your hands are mirror images of one another, but they're not equal. If you took your left hand and put it on your right arm, you'd have a really hard time grabbing things because your thumb would be in the opposite position. All right. So even though they appear to be equal, they are not. And so these amino acids, these right-handed and left-handed amino acids are non-equal as well. But all known chemical reactions basically that would have occurred in prebiotic life give rise to equal amounts of both the left-handed and the right-handed versions. Right? But our proteins contain exclusively the left-handed version, none of the right-handed version. Right? How can you possibly explain this? Right? And basically, we can't explain it right now. All right, we really can't. But last year at the Society of Catholic Scientists meeting, a scientist actually got up and gave a talk that I was at, and I learned something. Right? I learned about the Murchison meteorite. Right? There's a meteorite that was presumably from a comet, has a lot of carbon content in it, and it contains amino acids that have been floating around in space in our solar system until the meteorite hit Earth. And interestingly, several amino acids contained in this meteorite are enriched in the L form, which is the form that's found in our proteins. So it appears that there's some unknown factor in the solar system that's giving rise to L amino acids, and we don't understand it right now, right? So this is my own example of presumption, right? I thought this was an impossible problem and reported towards the miraculous, but what appears not so miraculous, just poorly understood. Right? All right, so then what is a miracle, right? All right, so the first idea is one that we all have when we think of the miracle, and basically intervention in the order of the universe, order of nature by a supernatural agent. So basically it implies that something unnatural or extremely improbable happened, right? I want to propose a different idea or a different definition of a miracle, all right? That a miracle is basically any dependence of a natural occurrence on the supernatural. It doesn't have to be an unnatural occurrence or something that is extremely improbable. Right? And any action of God, right, is probable, just simply due to God's existence. And the universe we also know is willed and sustained by God. If you doubt this, right, Hebrews 1, verses 2 and 3 basically say, He spoke through us through His Son, who sustains all things by His mighty word. So God is continually sustaining existence, right? So again, a supernatural act on the natural occurrences that are dependent on a supernatural act, God's will. All right. So basically, every moment of existence is sustained through the will of God, and is therefore miraculous with this understanding of what miraculous is. And so, therefore, the miraculous is not unusual, but actually commonplace. If with this understanding of the miraculous, all right, and so therefore, saying that acts occurred through the normal order and processes of nature doesn't preclude the miraculous, right? Actually, if we have faith in God and God's sustenance of our world, basically it remains miraculous still. So we're kind of splitting hairs, saying, was this an unnatural or a natural occurrence? If you think about it in this sort of context. All right. So why then do we care about proving that something was a natural occurrence? Right. We favor this sort of miracle because we think it provides evidence for God, right? So if something truly unnatural occurred and we can demonstrate it, God must exist as a result of that. And Jesus himself uses this throughout his ministry, right? When he's healing lepers and curing the sick and rising from the dead, right? These are all examples of him using the miraculous to demonstrate his divinity to us. Right. But with when we place our faith in this, it's known as the God of the gaps problem. What the God of the gaps is basically basing our faith in God in something that is not understood yet. Right? It's basically saying we don't understand what's happening here. God must have done it. Right? Well, this is risk. There's a risk inherent to doing this because if we discover what a natural cause there, right, it can potentially shake our faith in God. So, a little bit more about the miraculous, right? The miraculous actually takes on different forms throughout salvation history. So, to be a Christian, you obviously have to believe in miracles, right? And you have to believe in what I'll call the essential miracles. It's the miracles surrounding Jesus, right? We have to believe that he died and rose again. But there are other levels of miracles. We have large-scale miracles like the Battle of Lepanto or Fatima. And then we have private miracles like miraculous healings, private revelation. I'm actually going to make a fourth category here, prehistoric miracles, like the creation of the cosmos, origin of life, creation of man, evolution versus creationism, stuff like that. All right, why am I making this fourth category? Because it is unique from the other three, and that this category is entirely unwitnessed. So it makes it inherently more difficult to prove. With all the others, we have eyewitness accounts, right? All right, so what's the sort of criteria or necessary for a unnatural miracle? All right, so basically for sainthood, we have these criteria there. All right, so a miracle must first of all be shown to be inexplicable based on current knowledge, but that alone is not sufficient to create a saint. All right, we also have to pair that with other criteria, like that saint has to be shown to have lived a life of heroic virtue. So the miracle is never on its own leading us to a conclusion about sainthood. And so the question I would like to propose is it responsible to conclude that the origin of life is inexplicable when numerous discoveries and insights are still being made? And even if it is inexplicable, is it responsible to use just that criteria and no other criteria to establish that this was a miraculous occurrence and points towards God? All right. Another possible requirement for a miracle, right? One that C.S. Lewis talks about is the fitness of a miracle. So he just describes all of salvation history as basically a story, and says that, all right, if there's a missing piece to the story, and I provide you with a page without any numbers on it or anything like that, you can presumably figure out whether or not that page belongs in that book just based on the context of the book and the information contained on that page. He says it's the same way with miracles. That the miracle has to fit into the story of salvation history. All right, on this requirement, I'd say that the origin of life being a necessity for salvation history definitely seems to fit into that idea. So we have kind of these competing ideas here. Some that say, okay, hey, hold on, not a miracle. This one's saying, all right, might be, right? All right. So on the other hand, another question I want to pose to you: what part of the origin of life necessitates a miracle? All right. Some pieces seem easy to explain. For instance, where did the amino acid glycine come from? It's very easy to make, found throughout the cosmos. Right. What I would propose to you is that it seems silly to imagine that God set up nature in such a way that it can accomplish pieces of this task, but not the entirety of it. That's just my proposition. We can argue about this, but it's an idea I want to propose to you. Right? All right. So now to what I believe. So basically, I think that we don't know enough right now. It might be miraculous. It might not be. I personally kind of waver one way or the other, depending on what we're talking about. All right. But what we should focus on is that it is amazing. All right. All that complexity, the beauty of all the different pieces working together is truly remarkable. All right. And if it was miraculous, regardless, there's still we can learn about how this might have occurred and all the different pieces that might have added together to give us this whole. All right, the God of the gaps problem. What are we supposed to do with that? All right. What I would say is that the God of the gaps isn't necessarily a problem as long as you approach it in the right way. So you don't want to use lack of knowledge as basis for your faith. But you focus on the miraculous nature of all of creation, right? And it doesn't necessarily matter if the event was unnatural or not, if it had a super miracle type cause, or if it was just a normal sort of miracle of existence, right? And this sort of attitude permits you to investigate and ask questions about it while still allowing for the possibility of unnatural miracles. And the last thing I'd say is I encourage you all to, instead of focusing on the history of life and the origin of life as proof for God, instead focus on the sublime nature of creation. I think there's much more strong proof of God there than there is in the history of the formation of life. And really, beauty and complexity of life point to our God in heaven and in His majesty, I would say. And I really love this painting I found online where I kind of see it as like the plant basically drawing all these things from matter and from the earth, right, to generate life, which then points upwards towards God, our Creator. Right? I don't know if that's what the artist was trying to depict. That's why I get out of it, though. All right. Anyways, that's it. So, questions, discussion, arguments. Anything? Yes. Yes.
I had like a two-pronged question. On the light spectrum, and the sequential folding on it, where do you put like prions or preons happening?
So prions are still proteins, but they have the ability to kind of make more copies of themselves, but in a non-lifelike manner, I would say, because they're not giving rise to anything that we say resembles life. They actually give rise to these rod-like structures. They're very kind of unlifelike, I would say. But regardless, so they do, proteins can, in some respect, I guess, produce, have this ability to replicate, but it's not actually replicating the molecule itself. It's actually misfolding other copies that have already been made. So it's a little bit different than the requirement for replication, I'd say. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Right.
When you talk
yeah.
Whenever you got a right character, assuming that's what's happening with protein, how does the protein know?
Yep. I kind of glossed over that detail. Yeah, basically, the protein knows it hit a right key, essentially, because that key is stable. There's intermolecular forces basically holding that particular state together, allowing it to basically unwaver or very much to a much lesser extent, basically, as it moves forward. So does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah.
Right.
100,000 theoretical possibilities. Because of the way it is, there's only one that's going to be stable, or half a dozen that are going to be stable, so therefore it will fall to that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
If I jump in the stairways, if I jump up, in theory, I can hit any one of the steps. Chances are I hit one below.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a similar sort of idea. Yeah, where you're restricting the total number of possibilities by events that are occurring during the process, I would say. Yeah. Any other questions? Any questions from students? Okay, Chris.
I'll just make a comment. I've learned a lot of my classes, amazingness, all that we can take away, appreciation of God's creation, not necessarily looking for all the unknown answers. And I think when it comes to advancements in artificial intelligence and a lot of these new technologies where we might one day actually create cells and create life, and all of a sudden does that rob people's faith? But when you understand that we are still part of that creation, and I think it just really helps. That way of thinking forms a really firm foundation of faith versus, as you said, kind of this shaky foundation, like, oh, when we fill in the gap, what happens to your faith? So I think it's an interesting connection to bring it back to human technology.
Like that. Yeah, thank you. Anything else? Nothing else. Thank you guys for staying. I know I went a little bit over time and stuff like that, but or maybe not. I can't really see the clock. Sorry.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. All right. But I have nothing else to say. So thank you guys.